Hi, Ed. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can anyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
I hear both.
And Marco?
Do you hear me?
Yep.
I can hear you. I was getting zoomed. It wanted to install something and then it didn't, and then it almost did, and then it didn't.
There was a bit of a kerfuffle in the internet world relating to the Zoom app, because apparently on Mac machines installed a some kind of a backdoor, basically, that would allow potentially, theoretically, a third party to turn on your video, without your consent. And so they issued a software patch for that, actually, an update. And I don't think it really caused too much harm, but that might be what that was about.
It could be. I always suspect that that something untoward is behind it all. I remember when I first moved to the United States, calling Germany was a big deal. And I had to find a provider that would actually give me an international line for some kind of reasonable rate to call Germany. And every time my wife called her sister, the transmission got really garbled and it was broken, and there's a lot of clicking and things in the line. And my wife said, why do we pay for this if it's so bad? I said, oh, that's just probably the CIA listening in, because they monitor all calls going out of the United States. And maybe they just need to fine tune their apparatus. And I said, so the next time you call and it's like that, just tell them I'm only talking to my sister. It's okay. And she did. And we never had problems again.
Well, I always have my suspicions. Particularly
I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but
So there's a cause and effect going on here, Ed.
Well, sometimes it seems like I'm getting some kind of transmission of ideas. I'm getting a brilliant, insight or some poetry, and I need to work with my computer. I need to get it out, and it all crashes. It seems like I'm being blocked by some nefarious forces. I just don't want it to get out. That's how I feel sometimes, because it always happens. It just seems timed.
The timing is impeccable. You can't plan that time. I can't imagine the consciousness that can make that happen. But
So is this the tone of the meeting today? That it's just
we're just exchanging anecdotes about technology. Hi, Doug. Hi, Jeremy. Hi, John.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hey guys,
Hi, John.
good to see you all.
Yeah. Long time no see.
Howdy.
You're looking good.
Who, me?
Yeah.
You can't be talking to us.
Oh, likewise. Yeah, just get to hop on here. I didn't have anything in mind exactly, but I just wanted to come say hello and see what's going on, and what the tone and tenor of these discussions are like these days. So good to see you all.
Hi, hey. Yeah, this is completely open.
Yeah.
I showed up likewise without any preconceived notions as to what would be discussed. And I think it's at least what was being teased out in the forum was that it kind of would be preparatory for a more structured discussion that could discuss your book or Gabester or related themes that have been kind of intersecting on the forum, which others could speak to better than I can, actually. There's stuff on quantum consciousness and the axial age, and I know that there's some intersections for sure with Gabester. So I'm as uncaught up as the next fellow here, and I'm just here to kind of learn and enjoy it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, sounds good.
Yesterday I spent the day reading Paradise Lost, which is another cross current here. But it was it was the most wonderful experience. The language is so gorgeous to read. So I spent my whole afternoon lifted by this reading.
I just started, actually, just the first part of the argument myself in preparation for Wednesday. And oh yeah, it feels like when the language itself is carrying you.
Yeah,
it's like
I mean, the
flight.
subject is like, you know, sin in its worst aspects, but the language, who cares?
That's the thing I liked about Paradise Lost. You could get jazzed about all the bad stuff.
Exactly.
You know, really, and you know, it's been said. I think, you know, Blake mentioned it. Milton might have been thinking he was writing about one thing, but he was actually writing about the other side. It's a lot more fun, that's for sure.
So I'll just note briefly that I have about 45 minutes from this point, and then I'll need to get on with the rest of the day. And I too have nothing planned or yeah, I think I mentioned on the forum that we only have what Jeffrey and another individual, Marco Massi, had proposed with the Quantum Café, and that's coming up, I guess, 3 weeks from today. So we have, if you'd like, next week we can arrange for anything here, anything we'd like to talk about. As Marco mentioned, we're discussing quite a bit, and we're all over the place. We're not necessarily, the cafe is essentially a table out in the middle of the field, and we come running from all directions to meet up at this one given time. But just to note, the table is always open, so if a nighttime would be better or alternate time, then we can make arrangements for that as well. But yeah, we'll move along slowly here and see where we go. Good to have you, Jeremy.
I'll just add that I'm going to hop off when you do as well, because we have sewage water seeping into our basement, and still have to line up contractors and various other assistants to get that resolved.
Well, good luck with that.
It's part of a larger gestalt that is overall positive, but certainly that's not very pleasant. Not very pleasant part of it. Speaking of Paradise Lost.
Huh. So yeah, I didn't get a chance to hear everyone's the last recording. It was just sort of funny because I popped back in. I was like, oh, everyone, there's been a talk about the book, which is just uncanny. So I'll probably listen to that a little bit later today, and I'll have a little bit more direct replies and thoughts about the content of the conversation. So, but yeah, just wanted to come in, say hi. And if we did want to have a conversation on Gepser, I guess I should listen to that talk so I know what you guys already talked about, and find some new direction to explore together. So, or questions. I know there was a couple of like, I think John posted a few things too about what not only would you ask me, but like what are the kind of the blind spots or difficulties or challenges that Gepser might face in the contemporary world in terms of critiques, you know? So that would be kind of cool and fun to explore as well. So anything and everything. Just kind of just dive into it, and we'll see what happens.
That would be kind of cool, because the stuff we're looking at for the axial age right now, it has a kind of, I mean, these guys really should have read Gepser. I think we all agree that they're a bit out to lunch on some areas because they haven't had the benefit of reading Gepser. I mean, one infers, Ed, you're laughing. You think they've read Gepser? I don't think so.
I don't think they'd touch him with a 10-foot pole if they knew he existed. That's just my own personal take on it. That's why I'm laughing. I really appreciated your observations in that regard. You know, the actual, you know, it's a key point. It just comes up that 500 BC. You know, and you have to deal with it. So these guys are dealing with it in their way. Gapeser went about it in his way. Those of us who have engaged Gapeser in any way, shape, or form have a slightly different understanding of what could be done with that. But these guys, you know, because that was the first thing that happened when I got the book. I opened it up. I looked back in the bibliography and said, okay, well, who's there? Well, obviously he's not, you know, because he never is. And when you look at the bibliographies from the individual contributions, he's not there, which is not surprising. So you kind of get the feel out like they're going to go at this a little differently than I would, or Jeremy would, because I think Gapeser brings a lot to that discussion, period. Because part of my problem with a lot of the things that we read these days, and this is just one example of it. I mean, I'm enjoying a lot of the things. Sometimes I like to be aggravated. I was as peeved with Donald's chapter as I was when I read his book, even though I found his book, like, out of that milieu, a step in the right direction. But he was like a baby step. He was afraid to actually step into it, kind of thing. But he is a cognitive psychologist, so he kind of has his own limits that he sets for himself. But there would be a lot to be gained by taking a broader view of what's going on. And these folks have a very narrow view. That's all there is to it. So each one comes at it from his or her specialty, and they present what they can in light of that. And you can go through, and that's what we have to do, actually, is go through and piece together, okay, well, how does this all fit together into a larger mosaic? And that's kind of how I see our discussion about the book itself. Well, what does this all say, and how does that accumulate into some kind of an understanding that we might have in regards to this particular point in history? And that's why I appreciated that TJ brought it up, because everybody talks about it, but nobody really deals with it, except in their own little kind of way. And I think it's a significant point, you know, whether it's a turning point or whether it's the hub around which everything turns. That we can talk about that as well. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced or unconvinced in any regard, but it opens up a field of discussion that I think, as you point out, Gapeser can contribute to in a very enriching way.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I miss in a lot of discussions that go on about history or sociology or cultural or communication. You know, there's just, it all kinds of, where a lot of times it comes up a little short, because you could open it up and look at it in a broader view than is generally done. And that's kind of what bugs me sometimes. That's what I appreciate about your book, Jeremy, because the focus is actually on, okay, well, how do we open this up a little more? And Gapeser gives us a way to get into that and open that up. And I think that's exceedingly helpful. We just have to get people to read it. And it's hard. And we had this is kind of a side discussion that we've had on the actual age thread. It's hard to get people to read Gapeser. Even when you know it and you say, well, look at this. I've known lots of, I love TJ's example. He gave his friend the book, said, just read chapter 3. He saw the word spiritual and beat feet. He goes, I'm not touching that. You know, why? But, you know, obviously an educated and open individual, but there are certain things that are just intimidating for some people. And then we do have, he's not the easiest writer in that regard. It's very dense. Well, you have to be prepared for that density. I know people that just said, my head hurts when I read it. I had that said to me. I'm going, yeah, okay, well then read it slowly. Read it slowly. And it's like, oh no, it'll just hurt all the time. I said, no, the pain goes away. The pain goes away. But it is, for a lot of people, especially in today's day and age, where we have people that have trouble following, let's say, a light novel or even a novella. You know, how do you get them to wade through Gapeser? You know, that's 500 pages of density. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like hacking your way through the jungle with a penknife instead of a machete. kind of thing. So I understand why some people have reservations about that. I would think that let's say, our scholarly colleagues who are used to reading lots of things would not get so bogged down so quickly. But I think the aversions come up quicker, and that might be something that puts them off. I'm not sure. I'm kind of speculating. I've been thinking a lot about why they haven't, and why they could have, and why they should have, and it was all there, but they missed it, and how does it all fit together? I'm trying to get my thoughts organized for Friday when we get together. But those are some of the things that have been going through my mind the last couple of days, hours, actually, since I was trying to get ready for Friday before I came on.
Yeah, I don't know. I taught a Gebser class pretty much straight through, like we did with Winter of Origin, and what went with that in tandem to the discussion was a lot of work. I had to basically create slides for each chapter, and the way it ended up happening was the only way that I found to get through teaching it was to really stick meticulously to the text and take passages and quote them and break them down for people, and to illustrate what Gebser's doing in his language, or at least in the translation, and just reiterating. And that was actually really interesting because it opened another layer of Gebser's writing, particularly the writing itself and the stylisms that he has, the way he's connecting his thoughts, the way he is as a thinker and a writer. And I think that really helped a lot of the students kind of get Gebser and move out of this hurts, what's he doing, it's too dense, into, okay, I get sort of the mechanisms and the stylisms, and I know what to expect. He's going to relate it to, that's the way he does. Like, he talks about the magical, but he's also lacing in the mythical and the mental and everything else. And everything is interwoven in a very meticulous way. And he just kind of carries you through the whole book that way. And I think once people start to get what that is and have like a name for it, and are picking up on those, on his writing style as a philosopher, then it gets a little easier. And then it also sort of makes a clearing, I think, for those poetic moments, which are in there everywhere and quite profound. But at the same time, a lot of what I kept getting was, I wouldn't have been able to do this without that accompanying kind of commentary on the writing. I wouldn't be able to have been able to get through the reading without the lectures. So I think it requires a lot of amplification and secondary sources and contextualizing, and then helping push people through. I don't know what it is, because some of the students were integral theory folks who had done very dense reading and had done other works themselves that were on par with Gebser in terms of complexity of thinking. And yet some of these folks, their response was, I don't know what to do with Gebser. He's doing something I've never seen before. I've never seen this in integral writing or integral theory before. So that was another common reaction from students, ones that I wasn't expecting that from. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's just like Gebser is this enigmatic, poetic, dense philosopher, but there's so many others that many people read, like Heidegger, or just really, anybody in the Western canon. I'm not really sure what it is about him that's so scary. But then on the other hand, folks who don't get him and are reading him and have that sort of conundrum where they don't understand, they can't articulate what he's saying, but the writing itself is doing something to them anyway. And that's been another response too. Like, I don't know what he's doing to me by reading this, but there's something going on with the way I'm thinking and feeling and perceiving that's getting reoriented as I'm reading it. So I think his effects are indirect and direct, and you just have to get people in the room and sitting down and you just have to expose people and then see if anything catalyzes. So yeah, I'm just sort of riffing on what you're saying about like the difficulty with getting people bringing people to water, right? Bring a horse to water, bring people to Gebser, and can't make them read him. But yeah. Anyway.
Those are I appreciate those particular observations, because I had done a reading group way back when. I kind of talked about it on the forum a little today. And that parallels, you expressed exceedingly well what it was that I was experiencing. I kind of dichotomized it into people got them, people didn't, and for whatever reasons, because it was a short post. But it was that idea. I do think that you're absolutely correct in observing, even if you read them and you don't think you're getting them and you go, I can't do this anymore, you get something anyway. And it would really be nice to do some kind of a long-term study to find out what happens to those folks later. And do they ever come back? Do they go through it again or whatnot? Kind of thing. So, but
Yeah,
that's a whole different topic. I know John wants to say something. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Not really, but I will say something. I think I met Jeremy. I think I saw you do an interview with William Irwin Thompson. And I really liked that interview. And I had been a big fan of William Irwin Thompson for a long time. And being in integral circles, I was like shocked that no one knew who he was. And much less knew who Gebser was. They all seemed to know who Ken Wilber was, but they hadn't even read much of Ken Wilber, I noticed. And I had a tendency I was reading Ken Wilber back in the 80s. I actually got fired from a job because I was a receptionist at down on Wall Street. And rather than paying attention to my environment, what was going on around me, I was reading Wilber's Up from Eden. I got fired. So I got fired for reading Wilbur. I'm very proud of that fact. But at any rate, I think I saw you shortly after I had seen that interview that you did with William Irwin Thompson at one of those Wilbur meetups in Manhattan. And I can't remember who the speaker was or who we gathered to talk about. But a lot of those exchanges were extremely lively, and I enjoyed the camaraderie. I know this sounds extremely pompous, but I wish that more people were at that time were better read than they actually were. But now I think things have changed. I feel like the online excursions I go into, and the interviews I listen to, and the podcasts that I hear, and the conversations that I have with my colleagues here, I feel like I'm around people who are in many ways much better read than I am. And they're much younger than I am. So I think that somehow feels to me like that's a good sign. So I recently listened to your podcasts, some of your interviews with Michael Garfield, Matt Segal, J.F. Martell, Michael Brooks, and Adam Roberts' interview with you. And I noticed a lot of you guys interview each other on some of your podcasts. So I think there's a lot of camaraderie among you. So I think that's interesting for me as an elder. I'm moving into my elderhood here without very many role models, because I think getting older in the kind of living arrangements we have now, I don't think we have much guidance. So I think those who are approaching middle age, who are in their maturity, approaching middle age, and those who are way beyond middle age, dealing with the changes that are occurring as you move into elderhood, have much more in common in some ways than I think, because I think we're all having to get older differently than previous generations have been pressed upon to perform differently. And when I say that, I'm very cautious because I don't want to fall into the easy kind of ageisms that are so easy for us to fall into. But I'm thinking about how, and I'm learning from the conversations that I've had with a lot of my friends here. You know, a lot of it for those of us who are parents. I'm not a parent, but some of us are, and working with children and developmental theories around childhood. I think and how traditionally we've set up our society so that the elders can transmit something called culture to the young. And there's some survival value in that. And also it gives a lot of direction to people. But I think that's, I don't know. I have a lot of question marks about that, because I think the influence, of course, children have always been hugely influenced, have had a huge influence on those that are around them. So they aren't just blank slates that, you know, we get them to perform in ways we want to. We know that doesn't work and doesn't happen. But I'm thinking, I hope I'm getting close to some sort of organizing a thoughtful response to listening to all of these interviews you've conducted, or interviews that have been done with you. So I think there's this intergenerational kind of eruption, because I feel like so many of the younger persons like yourself, who I think are so advanced in so many ways, and have had certain advantages that I did not have, like the internet. You know, what could I have done if I had been 18 with the internet? I was like, you know, I was an avid reader and very interested in really odd things, and certainly in the occult and the esoteric. But I think the research tool, the research that's available to us now, all generations have an opportunity to do research that was not even possible when I was growing up. And I think that's a real dramatic change. So I think there are many different kinds of influences going in many different directions that I think are interesting, because it's not just inevitable as you get older, I think, that senescence sets in and there's a decay and geriatric wards, and, you know, you're drooling into your oatmeal. That's sort of the inevitable closing. You get that, once you retire, you get that 15 years of getting ready to die. I think that it's not going to be very plausible, actually, the way the circumstances are now. So I think, and I found that very helpful, because so many of the developmental theories and the integral sort of hypothesized and implied that there's a great developmental explosion that can actually happen in the 50s, after the conventional sort of making a career, creating a family, that dominates most people's lives in their midlife, but that there's that potential in the 50s and perhaps the 60s. And so that always gave me great, I was very curious about that. I'm sort of waiting for it to kick in. It's like, hey, am I getting any signs of this happening? I remember asking my father that towards the end of his life, if this, when does the wisdom thing kick in? He laughed about that too. But anyway, I hope that stimulates something here. And if you have any responses to my response to, I would love to hear what that could be. And maybe we could create the conditions here for a potential further conversation where the different themes that, you know, we're exploring here could be sorted out a little bit, and we could give a little structure to, which I definitely like structuring these kind of events, so that I just don't stare into the camera and, you know, what's up here. So I would like that to happen. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, John. Just like a quick thought that really kind of got sparked when you were talking about the intergenerational context and then these podcasts. It's something that I'm hearing in a lot of different contexts that the emphasis on like what's new and what's emerging and what's the latest thing and how do we sort of hack the civilizational crisis and come up with all of these solutions to it. A lot of them tend to be looking back. You know, I was just listening to one podcast with Matt Segal and Adam Roberts, and I think one other guy from CIS. I forget his name at the moment, but they were all talking about something very similar. And at the same time, I'm seeing like Bonita Roy coming up with like the Guildcraft thing that's going on. And there's a sort of an interest in particularly, you know, the pre-modern in the sense of how did societies kind of enact themselves collectively? What kind of social systems did they cultivate and practice and develop for in terms of like intergenerational mastery and passing on skills? And so there seems to be a very strong desire to bring certain things back that previously would have been seen as very archaic and very traditional, and now they're being seen as this really kind of, ironically, kind of a leading edge thing to kind of bring back guild crafting and bring back like guild masters, instead of seeing, I think Bonita is being kind of positioned as sort of like a guild master here. Like she's studied consciousness studies and she has all these practices, and then everyone's kind of working with her, and she's sort of functioning more as an instructor and a mentor, or an artisan would, who has some kind of mastery of skill that the next generation's learning. So there seems to be like kind of a resuscitation of things that, linearly speaking, a few decades ago or even 10 years ago may have been seen, far too backwards looking. And now it's kind of forwards looking. We're going back to look forward. I was reading what Thomas Mann's Utopia recently, the Verso Books edition, and China Mieville, I think that's his name, and Ursula K. Le Guin have essays in there, and they're talking about this metaphor of sort of reclaiming the meaning of utopia, where basically it's like a First Nation phrase for this porcupine that backs up as it looks forward. And there's this sense that we're kind of backing up to look forward in anticipation of how to move, into the future for our survival. So between me looking at Gebser and saying like, this writer from 1949 is speaking directly to the present, and then all of these other people in these podcasting communities and these community building spaces are all kind of reviving the guild, and time is not so linear, and I don't think the idea that it's only the youthful generations that has some kind of solution to our problems is really, we're not even buying that as youth anymore, So in a way, it's kind of a perspective in that sense, that the layers of time are communicating with one another, and not in a linear sense at all, but in sort of a texture. So I'm really liking how that's sort of coming up and arising very spontaneously without needing to be pushed or forced or argued for. It's just sort of people are coming to that in their own way in these different fields. So I found that really encouraging, and I found that really exciting because I'm plugging into like Adam Roberts and Matt Segal, and sure, we have overlapping fields, but they have a different context for why they're coming to these similar conclusions or convergences than I am. And there's a lot of energy here in these kinds of questions. So anyway, that's what sparked for me, John.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And I'm glad you mentioned Benita Roy. I remember her Magellan courses. I got engaged to those maybe a decade ago. And she was definitely a pioneering figure, I think, in developing these online communities. So, and I like the metaphor of a guild. I think that's a very attractive one that I think could capture, I think, some of the dynamics that are going on. I think the teacher and the student and the mentor are always going to be necessary and useful. But I've often found what I find most attractive and compelling about the relationships that are forming here and elsewhere is that we can offer sponsorship to one another, which is and I don't mean like in the AI way, of bringing your addicted friends to a meetup or something like that, although that's part of sponsorship. But I think there's something else about sponsorship where we can register a quality that a person has, and we can be drawn to that, and we can give our attention to that quality. And I believe it opens up possibilities for that person and for yourself. Because I think when we co-sponsor one another, it accelerates what is probably hidden, what's anticipatory, what's invisible, in ways that I don't think the traditional teacher-student formats encourage. Usually there's a skill or there's a knowledge that's being shaped in a certain way that a student can get it and be certified and qualified at the end of a course. And I think that's a very different kind of dynamic. And there are lots of wonderful courses out there, and I'm totally addicted to them. I don't know how many survey courses I've taken on Western civilization, and every new one that comes online, I want to enroll in it. So I'm very drawn to that kind of organization. But I think what we're doing, this collaborative sort of adventure, I think we've been engaged in is different. I think sponsorship is something that we're all learning how to do. And you can see other people, they have it, and it's just a natural sort of emerging capacity I think people have as they start to mature, that they want to drop the competition and want to encourage the collaboration, which I find so enjoyable in the interviews that I've seen you engage in with some of your contemporaries like Matt Segal and Michael Brooks and Michael Garfield. You're all pretty much in the same age range, and you're so it seems to me that you're very collaborative. Not that you can't compete, and not that there isn't an edge of intellectual competition. There certainly is, but it seems like it's all definitely serving this cooperative and collaborative sort of interplay, which I don't remember too much of when I was a younger man. It seemed like the men I was around, that I was in relationship with, it was very contentious and very competitive. Of course, I live in Manhattan, and but I may be wrong. I may be wrong. There may have been a lot more collaboration and cooperation going on that I wasn't aware of, because maybe I just wasn't paying as much attention to it as I am now as I get older. So anyway, I'm just wanting to share that, put that out there in the space. Thanks.
Nora Bates in her book has a line about has a discussion about talking with her daughter about this thing about the future based on the youth, and her daughter tells her the future is in the relationship between the generations, not in any one generation. So it was a very interesting, very interesting, contribution to the discussion that she made there.
Mm. Yeah, I've been meaning to have Nora on the Mutations podcast. I'll let you guys know when that's happening.
Yeah.
Actually, I think you guys probably have great. Have you done anything with her directly? Because I think you guys probably have great questions for her that I could definitely feed into the discussion.
We studied her book together. We had a reading group around Gregory and Nora. But no, we didn't have her on as a guest. That would be great.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, just a sort of agreement there, actually it's sort of a tangent, but I was just interacting with JF Martel on Twitter about the Apollo 11 documentary. And the connection here is the generational thing. It just came out, and I think it was just released on streaming services. I have it on Apple, and it's just, they found or restored this footage from the moon, the Apollo 11 mission. But it's so vivid. Like, it looks as if somebody took a modern HD camera, a digital camera, and went into the past and just kind of walked around looking at everybody and the food and their clothing. And it's just sort of this vivid time travel into the past, that there were certain moments in that film. I mean, not only is it sort of this interesting sort of mythological transcendental experience going with the moon landing and everything, but there was also this sense that, time in terms of what we mean by the future isn't something that happens at the leading edge of, linear time, but that there are certain, and I think Jeff and I talk about this too in our podcast, there are certain moments that feel like the future over others, that maybe the 1960s as a kind of peak experience for everybody, the future materialized in a way that was more transparent than it has in other decades and other periods. And there's this sense that that generation had access to the future in a way maybe we don't. We feel really far away from that period of the space age about to be ushered in, and 2001's coming out and everything. So there was this sort of a kind of a hauntology of the future there, that, like, you know, sometimes the past generation has more of a sense of what's latent than the oncoming generation. That it's not as sort of a linear thing, that the next generation will get what's emerging more than the previous one. So yeah, just kind of feeding into this sort of non-linearity of the future, and how multiple generations can kind of layer into that question.
So we're going to get, sorry, I'm going to go in one more time and then leave it to other people, but we're going to get into some of these issues in the quantum discussion in 3 weeks. The reason it's then is because Marco Masi is away for the next 2 weeks, so that's why it's been moved back a bit. But the Wendt book, which I almost finished, is an extraordinary book because it uses social science to make a compelling argument that quantum effects are present in our everyday lives, but by drawing on quantum theory to solve a number of problems in social science. It's a very interesting book. And one of the discussions that's in that book, and that I hope that we'll get into on August the 13th, is the time issue. So, because in the version of quantum theory that Wendt talks about, he's using a version that has this dual time thing going on, where they have the current time understanding of time is a kind of a moment moving forward, but then he has a reverse current of time that he associates with will, that is a kind of a teleological time, which is a purpose-driven time, but it moves backward. And so it has a very interesting, it brings us to rethink how we understand time in our daily lives, in the way it works in and around what we do. And I'm still trying to sort of fully untangle it as a kind of a way of thinking, but I think it's very relevant to what we're trying to do here on this site. And anyway, so I'm hoping to get more insight into it. And maybe, John, you read that book. I don't know how you feel about, whether you have some insights into that.
Well, it's like Gebser. I read it, I loved it, I didn't understand it. but that doesn't stop me.
It's not an easy book to understand because it's a very sort of structured logical argument about how all these different currents of thought intersect, and where he lays out all the pieces and then shows how one way is maybe a little bit more interesting than some of the other ways. But it's a very detailed argument to understand. But it is nonetheless very, very interesting. And interestingly, he points to evidential support that quantum poetics is actually grounded in evidential theory. So that the sort of things that we were just playing with turns out may have an actual scientific basis. So anyway.
Well, I also, I'm so glad you're reading that. And I love the section on language. I thought that's why I'm glad you're reading, because I thought you did so much work on quantum poetics, and I felt like there was a lot of overlaps there. But I read Wendt through the flip, reading Jeffrey Kripal's book, and he quoted a lot from Alexander Wendt, and so I did a little reading on him. But I found out about Kripal through Jeremy. And I think that's what's fun about these kind of communities, how they merge and how they cross-fertilize in interesting ways. And now I think we may be, as you were discussing with Matt Segal in that interview that you had with him, I think last year, Jeremy and Matt were reminiscing about the pioneering days of YouTube and how they were both starting to work in that area, and how it's changed. And some things have gotten consolidated and a little more slick and sophisticated. And also some of what was innovative about it has been sort of, I don't know, distorted in some ways by some of the more recent sort of interventions by, nefarious forces trying to commodify everything under the sun. So I think, but I think that when I often find myself reading something and I don't get it, but I find someone in my community who I think they will get it. I should get them to read it so that they could help a sort of so that we can help educate one another. Hi, Michael. Welcome aboard. Nice
Hi.
to see you.
I'm glad I made it.
So I think there's some. So when you start learning about the other person's tastes and their interests and what triggers their imagination, what shuts their imagination down, what pisses them off, what they like. I think those kinds of when we can do that in these in the online communiques that we're doing here now, that's pretty. Getting rapport with people online, it's really tricky. It's very different because I wasn't raised this way at all. I mean, I didn't get my first email account till I was in my mid-40s, whereas I believe maybe, Jeremy, you had an email account when you were a teenager or maybe even younger. And I think there is a difference that happens when the screen technology, when it's been introduced so early into a person's educational and socialization process. With the deleterious effects of that, we're starting to learn more and more and more about how some of that can really flatten a person's affective capacity, but also often it can accelerate certain capacities as well. So I think that's what's interesting to me now, is that I have this now and I didn't have it back then, is that I have enough people in these communities online that will spend time sharing attention around a book. That was really hard. That's been very hard to find in other places. Like in Manhattan, you go out, socialize at happy hour, and you sit on a bar stool next to somebody, and no one asks you, have you read any good books lately? And I think that's, but I think that's what's great about these online communities that we are creating together. So thanks.
I will say that one time, about 2006 or 7, I was reading Ken Wilber's Integral Spirituality on the subway, and somebody did approach me, and we had a nice conversation about it. I was very surprised because, I mean, I don't know if Wilbur was popular or not at the time, but that was one of those moments that felt kind of special. But yeah, I think generally you're right. There's, yeah, I guess like the younger generations have a better opportunity here. Like I grew up on like IRC chat rooms, like fantasy, freeform role play, RPG stuff. And then there were like philosophy chat rooms, and then YouTube was coming out. And then, so yeah, I guess I've sort of had that privilege of always, and a lot of us in the younger generations, of having access to this, really from, for me, middle school in terms of the chat rooms, but then late high school, early college for like this, like, organic network of YouTubers all sitting around posting videos, and somehow we reached each other. That's the thing. If you did this today on YouTube, I don't know if you'd be able to reach anybody. You'd just be kind of sending, signals out into a void. Just like, I don't know how people can network today. The algorithms are just so different. But back then, you post a video reading, I don't even know anything, a Wilbur book, your thoughts on the latest, William Gibson novel, whenever that time was, whenever it was, maybe it was Zero History. You'd get people to come back and reply with a video and a long comment and a thread, and you could just develop an organic community. And I don't think it's been curated that way. I think we've moved towards the marketing. So like you need high production video camera, and you need to know SEO, and you need really good design in terms of like your lighting and the sound, the audio and the video, and then also the banners and all of that stuff is just like, I don't know. I kind of wish we could just jump onto YouTube and meet people like we used to be able to do. So, but on the plus side, I think we can still do this like Twitter? I mean, we found, how do we all find each other? I don't know. How did this really, I mean, Marco and I know, but it's just kind of fun to see how it can still happen in some ways.
Well, I'll just say quickly with you, I think it was through Beams and Struts. So it was actually through some like remnant of that kind of organic web that you're talking about, because that's basically what Chris and Trevor and that whole crew did, is they just got together and decided that they're going to publish stuff. They're going to read each other's stuff, and they're going to bring their particular intellectual and spiritual interests into a mix and do something with it. And that, and then there was also like Facebook and, various other ways to connect. But I think where, what you were doing stood out for me was probably in something you wrote there, or something connected to that locus, that nexus. So anyway, I have so much more that I could comment on, but I don't even want to start. It's all in this little square of paper.
Maybe I'll throw back. I'll come back around to what John was saying though about podcasts, because I do think somehow podcasts still have that capacity. Now it's not as easy as throwing up a YouTube video where you just hit record on your iMovie or whatever, and then upload it. But I do think like just even my podcast isn't that frequent. It's going to be hopefully going forward, but in the little time that I've posted things, people have just found it through somehow they've come out of the ether somehow that I didn't know them. They weren't in my network, but yeah. But then what you're saying too about us like sharing and going on each other's shows. And I think that organic thing is still going on with podcasts somehow. They haven't gotten to that somehow, which is amazing and weird. And I hope it continues.
Well, I came to the Infinite Conversations website simply because of, I think, your first recording podcast with Daily Evolver, with Chet Salzberg, maybe back in 2017. And I listened to that and I said, oh yeah, Gebser rings a bell. I haven't read him. Did a search, and the first thing that popped up was the Winter of Origins. And I've stuck around since then. I didn't get a chance to participate in the Winter of Origins, but it's there, it's an archive. And so as I'm trying to read the book, at the same time I have, not exactly the same as question and answer with Jeremy or Ed or anything like that, but I did go back and I can respond to the threads in the past. I started a short thread about the way Getter uses we, the word we. So it's not just I say this or it was said, it is we are trying to do this. And I got responses from Ed and John, and I felt the poetic quality within the text and within the community that was forming here. So I stuck around, and as we were talking about the intergenerational aspect of it, I'm undercover right now, in a certain sense. I'm dipping out from work, and it's only a matter of time before I get caught reading the Ken Wilber book and get fired. But I'm willing to take that risk to be here, to participate, and it's that important to me. But I have a family. I introduce these thoughts to my wife. I am waiting to introduce these thoughts to my 5-year-old. I understand he can't participate in the conversations that go on here, but it's going to be available to him. And I'm investing, so to speak, in this website. I'm helping out with the innards. I've learned how to do WordPress a little bit here and there, how to process a video, and voila, here we are. And I hope in 10 years that my son is communicating with an even more elder version of John and Ed and Jeffrey and everyone here. And there's, as you were noting with the community that you were brought up into, that John didn't get to experience, that our children will literally he's already tapping into iPad technology. And even though we have no cable TV, we have no access to anything in the home other than download the occasional app. And so his time spent online is quality time. rather than I grew up on TV. It was still some quality, but it can be so focused and personalized in a more positive sense, not just siloed. And what we're talking about here, with Benita Roy and others developing these guilds, I feel, yeah, as the generations, maybe it's the time arrows colliding and reaching that point where it's not competition or collision with each generation. It's going to be more and more interaction and greatness and beauty, I think. So I'm looking forward to that. And yeah, I think that's all I need to say now. I do need to go. I'll be in transit, so I'll still be listening in, but great conversation.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
I want to go back to something you said a little earlier about the 60s, the moon landing. When here in Germany, they talk about the 68 revolution. That's when the student riots took place in Paris and in Berlin and all those places. And that spread very rapidly. That was one of the first real viral communications that happened. All of us who were at university at that time knew it. We all experienced it. It was a very poignant observation. It was like the future reached in and touched this entire generation. That's when I came of age. I never lost any of that. I still think like a 68er. I still act like a 68er. I still get abused from people here in the local community because I haven't grown up yet, of which I am quite proud, nonetheless, because what touched us in the future was of inestimable value. And my generation, I'm the oldest one here, I can say it, but my generation blew it. We gave that all up. We ignored it. We pushed it away. We bought into that corporate whatever it is. We figured, okay, well, whoever's really, all of the things that I think were abhorrent, who has the biggest car, the nicest house, the trophy wife, whatever it was, that was bullshit. And we needed to be more real. We needed to understand it was about human interaction. It was about humanity. It was about people in the end. And we missed that. And that's always kind of aggravated me. And then through, my life consists of a number of twists of fate. And in 1983, I end up in Silicon Valley. And everything is going buzzy. I mean, literally, there's no way to actually describe what it was like to be there at that time when Apple was still in the garage. And Microsoft hadn't written, well, they haven't to this day written a single program on their own. But when they were establishing themselves as the tech giant and PCs were starting to come into the workplace. My first encounter with the internet was you had to type in the IP address. You had to actually type in a 9-digit number in order to go somewhere. And then it was all text. There was no video. There was no image. There wasn't, people were coming up with those silly emoticons date back to then, where people were trying to make smileys out of text and trying to make a person out of, and it was all ASCII text, and it was all, what's that called? Non-proportional fonts. There was only 80 characters across the screen. There's only 30 lines. That's it. That's all you had to deal with. And what amazed me back then is that you could go onto a computer somewhere because you found out that you could type in that number and get there, and you could log in as a guest. And sometimes you met people there who were also, it was so weird because you would go on, you were thinking you were with the computer, and suddenly somebody starts talking to you because chat was like common. And so you would exchange a few things, and you'd download an app, or you'd get a file that you thought was there that was interesting. And you were interacting with people all over the world. And I'm sitting in California somewhere. And not too much later, this is just this is when the webs actually came up. This is you guys' generation, so to speak. And we had in our office, because we were a tech company, we also had one computer that was on the internet. And at the point in time when I first typed in a web address, 80% of everybody who was on the World Wide Web lived within 10 miles of my house. It wasn't the world, but it was the world, because you didn't know any of them. You had no idea where they were. You didn't know if they were down the street, across the block, or maybe they were in Tel Aviv. Maybe they were in Moscow, because there were a few of them. There's that other 20% was out there as well. And you were communicating with people in pure text about things that mattered to you. And that was the part that I found so interesting. So a lot of things happened through what were called news groups that were out there. It was alt this, if you were in the alternative, but they were all named, soak city ethnic, and then you knew you were talking about the ethnical composition of the sociological and ethnic composition of city dwellers as opposed to others. And there were a lot of, my favorite sites were the alt sites, the alternatives. And there was alt magic, and there was alt tech, and there was alt this. And the boundaries between them were we talk about fluidity today. You couldn't draw a sharp line between this and that in any way, shape, or form. And you realized that you were engaging with people whom you'd never seen, you had never encountered in any way, but you were sharing a personal relationship. And I mention this because this is how I met Hans Grünig. We happened to be in the same alt group, exchanging mails and whatever. And when he decided he wanted to do his graduate work, he said, I'm looking around for grad schools, and I'm thinking about looking at a couple in California. And I said, well, I live out here. You can stay at our place. You can go look. And he says, okay. And so he booked a ticket and came out. Well, we had never seen each other. We'd only ever seen what we had typed on a screen. And of course, while I'm the newspaper under my arm, how else do you recognize somebody that's there? And Hans said to me, let's just see. I'll never forget this. So I said, all right, we'll just see. And I drove to the airport to meet a plane, having no idea which one of those 250, 300 passengers was Hans Grünig. And we were going to meet him. Then he walked out of the door and waved. And that's why I have a slightly different feeling about how this technology works. Because I actually, for all of the encumbrances that are there, and for all of the things that get in our way, and for all of the newness about it, and for all of we really don't know how it works. If we go back to typing in 9-digit numbers in order to get to a computer kind of thing, and there's somebody there, it really doesn't matter. There's something there. I know people who, we did a lot of modem work where you would have to send text over via modem. And I could type faster than any modem could transmit. And so I would type, and it was kind of like the telegraph operators back in the 19th century. You knew who was on the other end of the line by the rhythm of the taps that they made when they were sending their signals. And it was the same way with typing ASCII text. You kind of knew how the letters were popping up on the screen, who was actually replying at that time if you were in a chat room. And so there are lots of things, we'd ignore them all today. And we have too many other influences that are coming. We have too many other stimuli that are impinging on us and misdirecting our attention. But it's all still there if we just kind of like step back and let it be. And that's kind of what I like. And that's what I see in the podcasts. Because you can't really get in there and dick around with them. You see, they're just kind of there, and you know what they are. And I think that's the attractiveness of them. especially since, and it might be a disadvantage, you don't have to watch. You know, I have my youngest daughter is an avid podcast listener simply because she can listen while she's doing her housework. So she doesn't want to be distracted by that. She just wants to hear the words coming by. And it's not words that are just kind of raining down upon her or sprinkling over her or whatnot. She's actually choosing things to listen to because she thinks they have some kind of sense. So there are subtle byways, let's say, in this whole field of what we're doing that are reaching a lot of people. And those who like those kinds of things do go looking for them. There's a, you know, and that's one of the things that has improved in the last year. You can do a lot of searching if you don't use Google, you know, but you can find a lot of things if you can buck the algorithms that are trying to direct your attention somewhere. Once you know that that's happening, you can find ways to get around it. And that's part of the creativity, I think, of the people who are actually, let's say, networked, internet-wise. They know what the commercializers are trying to do. They know how they're approaching. They know that they're smart and they're trying to figure things out. But, well, I can figure things out too, and so we do that. And so there is that possibility, nonetheless, of, and this is to close the loop, recapturing some of that future that touched a lot of us a long time ago. Granted, a lot of my generation, people that are 70 years old, aren't dicking around on the internet as much as I do. But I've been doing it for a long time. So it's like, oh, okay, well, that's just something that you do. But for other people, my wife, it's like, why do you do that? That's insane. I'm like, well, you married me. You knew I was insane. It's your own fault. But I think there's a lot of possibility here. And I think we need to simply be aware that it's possible to allow those possibilities to happen if we're open to it. And that's one of the things that I like about Gabe. So it's one of the things that I like about what you're doing with him. It's simple because for me, the subtext is always, well, just open up. Just open up a little, you know, give it a chance. You know, you don't have to like it. You know, it can hurt the first time. Just open up. And I think that's a real important message that we need to be communicating. I just wanted to add that.
Ed, I just want to float this metaphor with your description. We still have hunter and gathering instincts, no matter what the material. No matter what the material, if it's new or not, we're going to hunt, we're going to gather, and it's going to be a ongoing learning curve. What are we going to be drawn to? Meat, sex, food, you know, or information in this size, in this age. And I like the way you described it because that's the way I use this technology. I haven't lost my instincts of what do I want to gather with this technology, you know, and I've made some mistakes, but that's all part for the course. So I like the way you laid it out because I'm only 5 years younger than you, a little behind you, but I have some memories of what you're saying. It's just like one of the things with this video part that I've been noticing is I was raised on TV, Kwai Chang Kang, Star Trek, Bonanza, you know? Well, you know, those shows, and they're not, you know, it's different, but just sitting in front of a TV and being raised that way, when my parents were raised partially in the transition from just phone to TV. So it's interesting to kind of oscillate, no matter where you're at, oscillate back and forth because, yeah, my children were raised in roughly the same as Jeremy. And, you know, some things don't change because teenagers or young people, just my experience, get an attitude when old folks don't know what the fuck they're doing. But, you know, I had the same attitude with my dad or mom when I said, don't you want to rock and roll? So.
Yeah, I want to mention too what you're saying about Ed, about hearing podcasts and the connectivity, the it's hard to get in there. You said it's hard to kind of get into the podcast and break it up and turn it into an algorithmatize it, or however you want to say it. I was just thinking of that McLuhan passage, and I can't remember where I've read this. It might have been Gutenberg Galaxy, somewhere else, where McLuhan is sort of quipping on, it's very hard to break down sound. And maybe, now with electronic media, it's a little different. But in terms of you as a listener hearing music, you don't divide it up spatially. You have to hear the whole thing, and you're really present for it. That's the only way to really enjoy your music or your conversations. You're tuning in. There's an attunement. And you can't fragment it the same way that you can fragment visual space. Auditory space is a very kind of a holistic experience. So just like when you mentioning that about needing to listen to the podcast and how that somehow is sort of vanguarding or safeguarding these organic connective experiences with other people, I think that may have a part to play in it. It's just, it's sort of, there's an immunological dimension to sound that prevents the spatial fragmentation from kind of really getting in there and ruining it the same way you could do with, let's say, like the YouTube medium, the visual medium. So that's just a sort of an initial thought. But yeah, I totally appreciate your still living 1968. Have you, any of you heard, last year Debashish Banerjee had a conference called I think Whatever Happened to 1968, something along those lines. It was hosted at CIS, and it was sort of in the context of colonialism and Indian spirituality, but it's also kind of bringing in the revolutionary aspect of CIS and when it was founded and everything. So you guys might appreciate that. That's sort of bringing in the integral yoga dimension to that period. But yeah, just sort of chiming in there with the sound, actually, and the importance of sound. I love listening to podcasts too. They end up being a one of the ways in which the internet, in terms of always being present and always kind of invading our analog lives. People complain about it, always having something playing. But then on the other hand, when I'm listening to these podcasts, I really feel like I'm part of these communities. And I think that lends itself to, again, that organic sense of community building that arises through broadcasting podcasts and developing a listenership and then being on each other's shows. You feel like you're in the room with these other individuals. There is a communal sense that arises through listening over visually just watching something. So I want to get to that. And then also, like, just anecdotally, one of the things I get the most, the question I get the most is, when is Seeing Through the World going to be an audiobook? And then for all of the talks that I have on video is, can I send them as an MP3? Like, that's always a question. Can you send this as an audio track? I appreciate the conversation on video on YouTube, but I would really love an MP3 of that. Do you have a copy of that? And that's I get that all the time. And I think there's something to sound. So.
I personally think it's the long repressed, but now being reactivated mythical, because that was the sound part. We listened. It was all about listening. The whole, even when you read like the Old Testament, it's the Shema. It's the hear. Sometimes it means a bass. Sometimes it means just listen. But we need to listen. Somebody would say something, and we've kind of denigrated that in a lot of ways. And we said, well, we're all past that. Now we need to see what's going on, and we need to be, visually engaged. But I think we as human beings don't necessarily want to be so visually stimulated as much as we are. I know that sometimes I would just love to go out into the world blindfolded, so that I didn't have to see a lot of the crap that I have to see. Fortunately, I live in a rural community, so most of what I see is actually relatively pleasant to see. I don't have billboards. Well, billboards are basically banned in Germany anyhow, unless you've got some private land where you can stick one up. We got a fundamentalist down here in the next village over. He likes to put big signs up about Jesus, but in his fields. But they're so few and far between, because the idea is you shouldn't be distracted when you're driving. And in a country where they don't have speed limits on the super highways, then you always want people to be paying attention. And since most people don't pay attention to the speed limits on the secondary roads where there is one, you wish they were too. But there's something about being just, you can allow yourself to be absorbed. You know, if you have an engaging speaker, you can listen. You know, I don't care whether he's a preacher or whether he's somebody else or whether he's a lecturer or whether he's somebody that's giving a talk somewhere. It's good to just sit back in the back of the room, close your eyes, and let the words come. And it's a whole different sense of engagement than if you are I think distracted by the visual stimuli that come along with that. And I think that a lot of people recognize that, and that's why they would like to be able to pass that on, because there's a lot of things that we talk about here. Fortunately, we generally have MP3s in a lot of the cases where we could send them on to someone. And I could tell my daughter, okay, well, maybe you want to listen to the conversation we had last night, and I can give her that. But she's not going to sit down and look at a video, I know, because that's just not what she does. She listens. No, she doesn't listen to me. She listens.
I want to add something to that. We've had an ongoing conversation about the differences with the auditory and the visual and the kinesthetic. And I believe that synesthesias happen in the in-between, those liminal zones where we're just playing and we're not getting addicted to one style. And I was listening to Jeremy, and it was JF Martel in a podcast, and I was washing my dishes while I was listening to their voices. That was very satisfying. And also, there's this. This is a sketch that I made, and I threw it away, but now I'm looking for it again. It's a sort of it's a cat man, okay? I went through this a couple of months ago with the group. And this is crucifixion of the cat. There's a man, the observer, contemplating Schrodinger's cat. This looks like something out of Alice in Wonderland. And these are just visuals, but they're not just visuals. Where did I put that? They're gestures, just like those handprints and those caves. These are gestures, where hands, eyes, voices, the listening sound, they're all coming out of the same space in a way. And I think this is where, this is not the same thing as PowerPoint, okay? It's not the same thing as getting an algorithm. It's a communication from my very warped and sometimes nightmarish imagination. And I think that's a different kind of style, which is allowed through this kind of setup, through these Zoom conferences that you cannot and will never get from a podcast, no matter how beautiful the podcast performance is. Certainly poetry on podcasts and certain conversations, especially when it's a duet, works extremely well on a podcast. I do not find it works particularly well when there are 3 or more people on a podcast. Whereas there's something about looking at a face while they're searching for some words, and looking at their hands as they're looking for those words, I find incredibly beautiful and mesmerizing even. I don't get that when there are 10 heads talking little heads in a box, sort of trapped on a screen like the panopticon version. So that's why I made a plea for Speakers View. When we publish these recordings, I want to see, I know it's an illusion, but it gives me a sense of I'm in the same room watching a person with a face and hands and voice grappling with something. And I like it when they space out and they're vague and they're a mess. I think that's often where our best ideas come from. And I loved what you said, Jeremy, about the aperspectival and how Gebser uses that A to slip through something very subversive. He's sort of deconstructing through that word, the subject-object kind of grid. And I don't know if you said this, maybe, but I just noted this down, normalizing aperspectivity. I'm not sure if you said that or somebody else did, or maybe I'm just making it up. But I think about all these tortured conversations so many of us have had about talking about the integral, talking about the aperspectival, rather than just coming from the aperspective, coming from the integral. I think we're doing it all the time. We're not giving a lot of attention to it when it happens. I don't think it is in any of us as individuals. I do believe it happens to us in groups, which are in rapport. High levels of rapport, I believe, are going to be required. And with the intention that something like the aperspectival can happen if we act as if it could happen. So it's definitely an imaginative leap, just like putting on a costume and some makeup and coming up with some interesting things to say, and then taking off the makeup, taking off the costume, and you go out and have a beer. I think these are performances, and we can intend that they be like an integral occasion, or it could be aperspectival-ish. It doesn't have to be exactly aperspectival. It can be sort of like aperspectival. But I think going from something like this to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You know, just going into a little bit of iambic pentameter once in a while with Shakespeare changes our brains. Looking at somebody's crude sketch or doodle they made on the back of a cocktail napkin rearranges us in ways I don't think carefully orchestrated complete sentences in a paragraph within an essay can do. So I'm all for essays and writing, and we do a lot of that here. We switch around from speech acts like this, collectively. It's much more like playing soccer than it is like making a complete sentence. But then we can go into the form, and we can work on a thread, and we can make complete sentences together. And I think that's where the aperspectival will sort of slip in. And we may not even be aware of it. These kind of liminal zones that happen between the written and the speech act and the doodle, you know. So I make a plea for the doodles on the back of the cocktail napkins. Don't throw them away, save them. Bring them here, show them to us, because it may be the seed of some enormous breakthrough that you would not notice if you're working in too deliberate a fashion on solving a problem. Because I think it's our attempts to solve the problem, which of course keep us mired in the problem. And very often breakthroughs and solutions occur spontaneously because we just allow ourselves to enter into a kind of phase space, those kind of fuzzy, weird kind of liminal zones, which I believe we celebrate together here. I think this is something that's pretty rare actually, where people can come into a public space like this and you know, share their, you know, confusion. But I think that's where, but it's not confusion for the sake of confusion. It's sort of just accepting, okay, well, this is sort of odd and weird and strange and a little uncanny. And rather than brush it under the rug, let's give some attention to it, because I think that's where these anomalies that we brush under the rug, because we've all been trained to do this, we can give a little bit of attention to them and overcome the initial discomfort. There may be something of great value. So thank you.
Well said, John. I with the language about integral and aperspectivity, you know, it's really nowhere in Gebser's writing that he wants you to just sort of like pin it down, you know? And I think in some of the other writing, like with Wilbur and other kind of post post-Gipsarian integral literature, there's this desire to define what the new style of thinking exactly is and where it's appearing, and how we can really kind of get that down. But my understanding with Gebser has always been that like clarity, and what he talks about so often, is not the same as pinpoint precision of the sort of the mental and understanding what it is. You know, there's clarity is an opening, clarity is a clearing, right? And he's always asking you to make a clearing for it rather than kind of put an object in the middle of that clearing and say that's the integral. And it seems to be a prerequisite to be able to even cultivate, you know, the perception at this a perspectival, I don't know, style, and understanding the relation between things, and systasis and syneresis and all those other words he plays with. I think that again the precursor to that, or what's like underlying all of that, is this clearing that opens up in things. And maybe that's why myself have just been so drawn to literature in, not necessarily the postmodern discourse, but any kind of literature and philosophy that's looking for those gaps and fissions and openings in thinking that allow this to kind of come through. And I know the danger there, of course, is, well, if you allow, like Gebser says, you know, if you put down the mantle of the rational, then the irrational could also come up too. And how do you distinguish that with the irrational? But again, like the impulse or impetus or injunction he's saying is to have a clearing, and you're not going to get, in theory, carried away necessarily with things if you really are trying to be present for that and coming back to that. It's like a contemplative practice, you know. It's a deepening and an opening, and it's not abstract. So you know, to go back to what Ed was saying too, the radical thing about all of this is presence. You know, if you really are present and allow yourself to go back to that clearing, who knows what could happen there? And that's the thing, the constructs and the difficulties and the obstructions from, you know, what the mental rational is built up, or however we're calling it, the space between stories like Eisenstein, all those things, those aren't necessarily in the way. I mean, all we have to do is at least begin to attempt to be present, and then work in whatever we're doing through that presence. So yeah, I've just really appreciated Gebser's approach recently after doing the class. The whole book is kind of a meditative invitation. You know, everyone talks about how it's so heady and difficult, but in almost every page he's saying, you know, be present, let's be clear, let's sort of like step back a little bit, presence. And that's really what he's saying, you know? So anyway, and just as like a thought too, in terms of the obfuscation and the difficulty about what integral means. Again, like we're talking about with the past being in the future. Maybe Gebser was like that. And I kind of think of him in that way too, that here he was writing about this in 1949 or having these experiences in the 30s. And the way he was able to be present with those experiences was, you know, he was able to express, you know, things that we're only kind of coming around to right now, you know. And I don't even know if right now is going to be that time, like we're saying, with all the rise of the guild stuff, and is this really it, or is there going to be another reification of the perspectival world? I don't know if this is really like the future either, but I think in this moment, you know, we're a little bit more present to the future. And these technologies don't need to be weaponized as these kind of apparatus of the mental rational and the perspectival, and designing our computers and our apps as algorithms that I always talk about this, the slot machine algorithm that they all use. Like, we don't need to do that with the technology. There's nothing intrinsic about this communication medium that needs to reify those things, especially if we are seeking out these zones like podcasts or what you're talking about with our Zoom calls. You know, they can be fairly radical spaces. And if we are vulnerable to that, present to that, creatively inspired by that, and the producers of culture, in that sense of we're the ones going out and making these things and writing books and creating communities, and then it doesn't have to be as dire as it appears. So I'm with Ed too, and with you about the possibilities with a lot of these technologies, not because it's a technology, but because of it's a space that we've kind of outered and constructed, and it doesn't have to just be a deficient mental space. That's really up to us. It really kind of brings it back. Like Gebser talks about that too, that the technology has been emancipated from us, but if we retract that and be present, it has absolutely no power over us anymore. And we can really encapsulate it again, or internalize it again, or intensify it with consciousness, like what Thompson always talks about, to kind of flip it again, from the technological and the material and back around to the to one's consciousness. So anyway, I really like what you said, John. So thank you for that.
It's just, it's a kind of non sequitur, but your doodles, John. So there's a French word for doodles. It's called un gribouillis. It's an odd word. And I was just looking at the etymology of it. It's not that clear, the etymology of it, but whenever I used to hear the word, my wife used it quite a lot. I tend to think of a little monster, a little grebouille that makes these things, that spits them out, if you like. And so a doodle is a gribouille is a kind of monstrous production, which is maybe an interesting way to think about them.
I have to get going.
The German speakers would say, let the poltergeist polter.
I have to get going to the meeting coming up, and
we're still
to deal
surprised
with.
to see you here, Marco. You hung on.
Oh yeah, well, it was a fascinating discussion, and I kept having thoughts, and so I couldn't just leave them. I'm not such a doodler, but I've got these sticky notes, and somehow I'm going to make sense of these. These will probably not make it into a coherent statement imminently, but hopefully they'll make it into a poem or something like that. That's, I think, part of what I've really gotten or get out of these occasions is inspiration and kind of poetic juice. And I think also like this idea of like humans or us being more like waves, or as much like waves as like particles or singular points. That is an interesting way of thinking about things, because waves interact in ways that create intensification, amplification, or interference patterns. There's interesting dynamics, I think, that can be explored when we look at things through that lens, and there are many others. I think the media itself, or the idea of the medium, or of being mediums, is something that came to mind, not just through the connection with McLuhan, but even in terms of what, Jeremy, you described in terms of like what you're doing to, I don't want to say translate because that's not technically right, but convey, transmit, I don't know, transware the the Gebserian, the insight that you get if you attune with and read a text that actually brings you to an experiential sort of, it's not just a state, it's really a zone in a way. That's one way of thinking about it. But then the mediation that you do, and it's like mediation in that you're creating media, and it's mediation in that you're mediating a text, you're in between like an experience, a text that is invoking, some ways representing, clearing spaces. I mean, doing a lot of different things to it's really, I mean, this gets into the question of like what it is that reading and writing actually does, because there's that magical, I think, dimension of it. And then that's can be transposed. This is really just jumping around, but into the technology. It has the simplest, I think, manifestation in the sense that there is another there, like on the other side. And how simple that could be, like from just typing an IP address and having a chat to a full-fledged audiovisual type of telepresence. But the root of it is that there is another there. And I think that that's profoundly spiritual, actually. We take for granted how accessible that is now and how inaccessible that would be or was or is in other locations, like without the tech, without the internet. Like who would be the other? You would have to pray. There would have to be some supernatural or supernatural relationship. And now we have supernatural relationships normalized, basically, like as just like, flip the switch and, it's just there. And not even more than normalized, ubiquitous. Basically, we're going to live and we are becoming sort of living in the internet, essentially. Like the internet is fusing with reality. I think that's the like the telos of, the Internet of Things. And these voices, which were supernatural, are actually just technologically mediated like realities. Like we're all real where we are, and we're real to each other through this hyperspace, this hyperspatial medium. And then time is very different here, therefore. And I wonder if the 60s were kind of more like not like the big one, but almost a pre-shock to a bigger shock. Like, like the earthquakes in California, how you don't know when the big one is coming. Is this like the aftershock? Is it the big one? Is it the one that before the big one? I wonder if the 60s is like the prequel to the bigger shock, which we're actually kind of living through right now. Like we're in that kind of like that exponential curve of eruption. And that's why we resonate so much with the 60s. And we're kind of creating these resonance amplifications. I have this book here. Check this out. You see that?
Oh, that's awesome. There we go.
But I open it, it's like I read it, and it's like, this is futuristic content here still. Like, so I feel like there's another wave to be strong. I want to hit a bell. I want to hit a bell. I want to make that resonate like louder, because we have this kind of time wave effect that we're kind of amplifying. And I think that's where the intergenerational axis it could be profound. Like, and so I don't know, I'm just rambling, like I said, but and I really should go. But this was a prequel as well to a further conversation. So just leaving it at that might be adequate. And I'll just say thank you to all of you.
Nice, Marco.
You, Marco.
Yeah, until next time.
Thanks, Marco.
Okay, I'm gonna have to make one of you the host just to continue
Isn't Jeffrey
on.
already?
Yeah, he is now.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Now, officially, good job.
Do you want to?
So I have a question in terms of, because I've been reading a lot of stuff about the significance of orientation with our bodies in consciousness. Does that make sense? That having a sense of other begins with being orientated with our body and then seeing across space another. And it's very fuzzy and intuitively of how it's like we've disembedded ourselves from the earth, but we're not totally disembedded. In some way, we got to come. This story of consciousness and where we're going with it needs to come back around and, to use the word, integrate, if that makes sense. So orientation is just a concept that I wonder how much it plays in with Gebser, Jeremy.
Yeah. So one of the things that I was just thinking of. Sorry, I'm still kind of like echoing your statement now, Marco's statement. It's all kind of weird.
Okay, that's fine.
Together.
That's fine. That's fine.
But so would you say you're kind of asking about the relation between really kind of the phenomenology of abstraction, like the feeling disconnected from kind of detached from presence and the body?
Yeah, and how maybe, now I'm just riffing, so this is unformed thought, how when the mental and especially rational came online, it cut off the presence within us, that also, based on what I understand of the previous structures, we were fully participating in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that
yes.
any better?
Yeah. Okay, good. Because I was thinking of one line that Gebser says in I think the second part of the EPO, where he's kind of reviewing Western philosophy and 20th century Western philosophy and talking about Heidegger and Sartre and nausea, and he's describing. But I like, he's picking up on a word, on a phrase in Western philosophy of being thrown into the world, of being thrown naked into the world, into being. But he's reading this through the structures, and he's saying, well, they're really sort of describing what the late mental has done to itself. It's extracted itself from that participation, and it's like, phenomenologically, it's almost as if you had woken up one day and then you never went back to sleep. You didn't need to sleep anymore. But it didn't mean you're good with that. It's like you feel there's a whole aspect of your being you no longer have access to. And so there's this alienation, not only in the new spatial world, but also a cutting off from the past. And then also a cutting off from the future. There's only the spatial present, which the spiritual is receding and the participation is receding. And so there's a kind of a closing down and a nakedness of the world that he's sort of describing, the negativa aspect of 20th century philosophy exploring. And he's like, this is part of the problem with the mental structure. It's that cutting off from the past and the loss of the future, actually, the loss of the spiritual mutational present to create, and just having that flat now in which you are sort of thrown into. And so, yes, I think absolutely there's the older structures, and as he says in the sort of the morphology of the structures, the archaic, magic, mythic have more of that sense of origin. The presence of origin is there. It's just sort of naturally suffusing things. The numinosity of the soul and the spirit are kind of pervasive. So when you extract yourself from that, there is a loss of participation. There's a gain. There's a terrific gain, which is your concretized sense of self in space, but it comes at a loss. And he's always talking about that measure and mass and gain and loss. And I think that's to me, that's why I've always liked Gebser so much more than many of, in this regard, about the evolution of consciousness, because a lot of us, being moderns, we narrativize, like we've kind of grown up out of the infantile stages, and we're no longer, those were almost kind of illusory phantasms that we just sort of lived in an enchanted world, and now we're adults, now we're awake. And Gebser totally deconstructs that. He eviscerates that throughout EPO. You can't talk about the gaining of the mental, at least in the history of our consciousness, without the loss of the magic and mythic. And then those show up in unhealthy ways in the mental, right? That he's always talking about with mass movements and 20th century issues and all that. So, it's an antidote to a lot of the linearity that we get in other narratives that assume the same narrative, that the mental structure is somehow grown up beyond the childhood of humanity. And Gebser respects those structures far too much. You know, they're dangerous, they're powerful. If we think they're just children, it's almost as if I get the image of, like, you know, the changeling. You know, we think it's just a little kid, but holy shit, that is something you can't even imagine. You know,
Right.
you have to respect those dimensions of being, and our ancestors are really good at that. And so they have a kind of a genius that we've lost contact with. And so, again, the linearity of it subsides. And now there's this sort of, well, how can we be more of a whole human being and reintegrate that without getting subsumed in it? Because it's very easy to get subsumed too. And there is a reason why we extracted from it. You know, we should trust that as well. We should trust the loss as well as the gain, which again is.
Because did each structure go through a similar, you know, angst about losing something?
I think that is the general sense in EPO that I get from Gebser, that each new mutation, right, from the magic to the mythic, there's a new access to dimensionality and a new kind of ontology that opens up. And then the other one is, it very often kind of goes through that deficient phase where you have to kind of push against it a little bit, like all of the myths of you know, conquering the dragons and the serpents and kind of standing on. Gebser has these great passages where he's interpreting this sort of the biblical image of Christ standing on the water, and this idea of like the logos emerging out of the mythos. So there's this sort of there's a new space that opens up, and then you kind of have to guard against the deficient expression of the older structure that is threatening, and in some sense, you know, actively trying to prevent this emergence. Right. And we get the same thing going on right now, right, with the mental structure and this new aperspectival style. Like, we do have that feeling of that what was once an ontology has now become a kind of a tomb that we want to break out of. You know, we feel kind of stuck in it, that it's become toxified somehow.
But so, that way that you just laid it out, and actually, to me, in the face of that, can be looked at as, like you said, of not despairing. It's part of what's going on, and there is still there's possibilities of, I don't know if I can use this word, but growing beyond our angst right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that for me is why Gebser is so prescient for right now, because he's talking about a tremendous intensification, a new possibility. He's saying, you know, the spiritual creative origin is present, and it's responsible for, you know, human beings bearing these transformations, and it's happening again. So there's this wonderful opening and opportunity that's happening at the same time that the situation is really dire. You know,
I just got the book and read it, and I was talking to Ed about this, is this line in there in the first chapter about an insightful process of intense awareness. And intensity's been part of that's why I vibe with Gebser focusing on intensity, because coming from a trauma situation, you're always dealing with intensity, and you have to get a handle on it, or, you know, work with it. But the way you get a handle on it can be deficient or, you know, better. And it's like, I was talking to somebody yesterday that she's reframing anxiety as excitement. And I get that, reframe it, but that's not the whole story. You can be intensely excited and still fuck up. You know, you can let your excitement, even if you reframe it. So, you know, to me, seeing those two, kind of that polarity, it's working with the intensity, dropping down in the intensity, and working with, you know, whether it's anxiety or excitement. And that's why that use of word of intensifying is very relevant. And that's where I feel I'm attuned to what Gebser's trying to bring forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's got that phrase, you know, we shouldn't pander to optimism, but still kind of be open to
nice.
emerging. So he's always kind of like, you know, we're not with the Spanglers about the decline of civilization, and we're not with the techno optimists that think we're marching towards greater and greater progress. We have to like find in, you know, that fissure, that in-betweenness. And he's always telling us to go there, and the attitude, which to me is it's relevant to the definition of what intensification really means. He's always talking about clarity being synonymous with it or related to it. Clarity, you don't think of clarity as something very intensified, but there's an awareness or a wearing that is not trying to get too high and it's not trying to get too low or depressed about things. You know, it's kind of being, again, in that liminal space.
Yeah, and so it has parallels with the Buddhist middle way. If you truly understand the middle way,
yeah,
it feels like of where working with the interdependence of whatever tension of polarity, you stay away from trying to lock onto one side, but you drop down into the, like you're saying, that fissure point that you have to work with.
I just want to add something to this. I know we're getting ready to wrap up pretty soon, and you're talking about intensification and intensity. And as I recall, somewhere I think Gebser said that the integral is not going to be about expansion of consciousness. It's about the intensification of consciousness. And I believe a lot of our efforts here, I think this pattern is we make a frame, which is not an easy thing to do, by the way, for a group to come up with a frame. We've had a crisis of the frame on more than one occasion. But I think when we make a frame, then we can break the frame. And when we can break the frame, we can transform, a trans frame, if you will. And I believe this is the heart of what Nora Bateson was describing by semathesy and by the idea that we're not trapped in these cognocentric silos. It's what's happening in the in-between, these liminal, sometimes very playful, sometimes scary liminal spaces, where we can then transform. But you can't transform if you have no form. And that's what I have found problematic about, and I don't want to blame the postmodern for this, but there's this, you know, what I call the postmodern drift, just thinking if we just get together and have fun, something will happen. I sort of like that idea, but I also feel like we're missing opportunities, especially if we're creating a public space. I feel like we need to work with the intensity rather than come together and, like in these post-traumatic stress syndromes, where people just freeze and smile at the camera, rather than allow themselves, those neuromuscular locks, to start to relax. And as those neuromuscular locks start to relax, the person starts to wobble and the group starts to wobble, because there's a whole lot more energy that's being unleashed in the system than when they're, you know, they're tight ass, tight stomach, tight chest, tight voice, and up in their heads, spinning all kinds of different maps that they've read from Aristotle and Plato and Ken Wilber. And that's where I think the challenge is when we just start to relax, relax, relax. Oh, that's kind of scary. You know, something all of a sudden starts to wobble, and you feel a little bit out of control. And I believe we can, if you have rapport, if the group has rapport and we can learn, the group can learn about itself at another level. I believe it's, there's enough maturity so that you can deal with the intensification of consciousness. If the maturity isn't there, you shouldn't even try. You know, just talk about something pleasant like the weather, or, you know, Donald Trump's gaffe of the day. But if you're going to work, I think, with this intensification, and I believe Gebser was recognizing that people don't often volunteer for this kind of work. It happens to them. Life is coming at you. And I think he went through the First and Second World War. So he, I think this is our comfort we want to find that comfort zone and enjoy that. But I think it comes at a high price, because we may just end up supporting the status quo in ourselves and one another, and just being very polite to one another, rather than taking the risk. And sometimes it gets very intense, and it's gotten very intense here. We've had occasions, I think, where people were up against it in a public space, and it's being recorded and posted on YouTube. But I think that's the challenge: is how can you reorganize a system like ourselves, which is, you know, everyone sort of knows each other pretty well, but it is a public forum. And I think that's a big challenge, and I hope we'll take this up in our next installment. I hope we I'll get a chance to review this recording when it gets posted, and hopefully, Jeremy, if you can watch the previous recording that we had featuring your work, I think that would be great, because you could sort of take a meta perspective on our previous gathering, and we can all take a meta perspective on this gathering that's happening right now. And maybe something will erupt between now and the next time we all get together. So thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Let me know, guys, when that would be. We don't have to decide right now, but we'll be in touch on the forum to figure out when that could happen. I'll listen to the conversation either today or tomorrow.
I also had a final comment that I wanted to make, picking up on something that Marco said just before he left. One of the things that I love about Infinite Conversations site, and I think to some extent one gets it through the podcast arrangements too, is that so it comes back to the McLuhan reference, if you like. The message becomes the medium, not so because we talk about all these things. We talk about Gebser, but we've integrated some of Gebserian thought into the way we go on and do things. We talk about quantum, and we integrate the quantum into some of our practices. And all of the discussions that we have, which are content focused, become the medium in some sense. And it's one of the fascinating things. You know, I had no idea when I was raising the quantum issues to begin with, to the extent to which they would become part of the way we all think about some of these things going on. And I think, Jeremy, your work has come thread back. You know, I mean, the Winter of Origin discussion, I wasn't there, but even if I wasn't there, it's profoundly affected my thinking and all of the thinking on the site, and threads back through all of these things. I think Doug was talking about a braided reading group, which is, I guess, is maybe all the reading groups are braided together, but it's kind of a, you know, and I tend to think in terms of fabric-like metaphors, because I do that, but it is a kind of braiding together of all these different threads, to use another fabric reference. Anyway, it's wonderful to witness, and I look forward to the next level of weavings.
I want you to make a garment and wear it.
I'm working on it.
Good to be back in the mix with you guys. So really appreciated today's call.
Thank you,
Yes,
Jeremy.
this was,
Thanks
very
for
enjoyable.
being present.
Learned a lot. Time well spent again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Okay. Have a good one.
Bye.